Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CGSR lecture series here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Asmar Asketom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center for Global Security Research. We have two guest speakers joining us today, Dr. Jonathan Brosmer and Dr. Fabian Villalobos, both from the RAND Corporation. They are presenting on a recent report they wrote called Time for Resilient Critical Materials Supply Chain Policies. As many of you already know, the supply chains of critical materials has become a hot topic in recent years as demand for critical materials is growing at a significant rate globally because of the energy transition. Many of the critical minerals used in clean energy tech are also used in defense applications. And the US and its closest allies depend on foreign imports, mainly from China, to meet its demand for critical materials, which increases the risk of potential supply disruptions. So our speakers will elaborate further on this topic by summarizing the state of critical materials and providing recommendations to increase the resilience of its supply chains to limit supply disruptions with a focus on the defense industry. Before I turn to the speakers, I'd like to say a few words to introduce them. Jonathan is the Associate Physical Scientist at the RAND Corporation. His work focuses on topics including Air Force acquisition and logistics, cyber, and command and control. Fabian is also an engineer at the RAND Corporation and a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. His work focuses on topics within the intersection of technology, economics, and geopolitics. So our speakers will present for about 45 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So Jonathan and Fabian, welcome to CGSR. Thank you for taking the time out today, taking time out of your day today, and I'll turn it over to you guys to get us started.
Thank you. Jonathan's going to start us off.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for the introductions, and today we're going to be talking about policy options to mitigate critical materials supply chains. We're going to give you guys a background, talk about current activities as it relates to rare earth elements and lithium. We're going to discuss a scenario for the rare earth elements and then the possible DoD posture and policy options that would be available to them. Lastly, we're going to talk about how this applies to lithium and then go to some conclusions and some takeaways. Next slide, please. So our study objectives were to analyze the resilience of critical material supply chains using rare earths and lithium as case studies. We wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy options available to the DoD and others to avoid or mitigate risks from potential supply disruptions. We want to estimate the magnitude of potential impacts from a disruption of a critical material supply chain and recommend policy options or the combination of options, both for a reactive and proactive posture, which I'll be explaining a little bit more about later. Next slide, please. Okay, so first, I'm going to ground everyone in critical minerals and just some basics. So there are 50 mineral commodities deemed critical or strategic to the US economy or national security. The Department of or the Secretary of the Interior and the USGS have outlined some factors or criteria that make a mineral commodity critical or strategic. And first, it's the global production is centered in countries that may be unable or unwilling to continue to supply to the US. The consumption is predominantly dependent on foreign supplies, or there's a large expenditure for US manufacturing industries with a low profitability, but that contribute greatly to our economy, or the mineral has a single domestic supplier. On the right-hand side of this chart, you see a periodic table. This periodic table highlights the rare earth elements, which is part of our case study today, and the elemental constituents that make up lithium-ion battery inputs. We also highlighted in yellow other critical materials or their mineral constituents. Next slide, please. So critical material supply chains. So The lack of a supply chain diversity is inherently risky, especially for countries with little domestic capacity. A constraint in any one of these sectors could be a point of origin for supply disruption, and disruption could affect the broader US economy. It could affect the defense industrial base's ability to procure critical materials. It could affect or interrupt military operations in extreme scenarios. We considered 3 of the 4 parts of the supply chain: extraction, processing, and components. And if we look on the right-hand side of the chart, we depicted a notional supply chain on critical materials processing and extraction for rare earth elements and lithium ion battery materials. I'll walk through the rare earth elements one. If we start with the rare earth elements, we have the light and heavy rare earths. They are processed into light and heavy rare earth oxides and ultimately separated. And then they are formed into rare earth magnets in this scenario here. And for lithium ion battery materials, we can start with lithium salts or ores, raw graphite, which gets processed into lithium carbonates or lithium hydroxide, and synthetic graphite, which then gets formed into anode and cathode materials and electrode sheets. Next slide, please. There are concerns that we have with critical materials extractions. Primarily, there are environmental concerns. With rare earth elements, these processes can generate 2,000 tons of waste in order to obtain 1 ton of rare earth oxide. So it's extremely solvent and waste intent and generates a lot of waste. The Chinese rare earth industry suffers from environmental problems because they use these traditional separation methods, which generates this much waste. Also, they suffer from illegal mine operations. Lithium ion battery materials have some of the same stories, especially with waste products and water usage and contamination. And there is also in the DRC with cobalt mining, child labor issues and armed conflict. Next slide, please. So the heavy rare earth elements are maybe considered the most important to the DoD, and they also happen to have the highest consumption by value. They are used in, the heavy rare earths are used in high-end electric motors and actuators, and phosphors are used in LED lights and night vision goggles. The magnets, these high-end magnets are also used in javelins and JDAM munitions and are found in the aircraft such as the F-35. It's not to say that the light or the heavy rare, it's not to say that the light rare earth elements are not important. They are important too. It's just their consumption by value is much less and they're easier to procure. And their uses are used in catalysis for oil and gas production. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned how the heavy rare earth elements were most important, and this slide here discusses the rare earth supply chain and the magnitude of the Chinese control. China has 30% of the global reserves. It accounts for 60% of mining activities, 80% of global processing capability, and nearly 100% of heavy rare earth processing. China continues to strengthen the position of its state-owned enterprises in the rare earth market. Originally, there were 6 major Chinese rare earth producers, of which were consolidated to 4 in December of 2021. And now with plans to consolidate down to 2, one for the heavy rare earth elements and one for the light rare earth elements. And on the right side of the chart here, it just depicts what I just said. we have the light rare earth elements in one column and the heavy rare earths in another column. China does much of the separating for the heavy rare earth elements. And in bold here in the rare earth products, you see neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, all of which are found in permanent magnet applications. Next slide.
So I'll spend a bit of time talking about this chart. Here we have a timeline of Chinese activity in the rare earth marketplace, matched up with their percentage of market share over time for extracted quantities. The blue line and down at the bottom is total extraction quantities. The red line is China's extracted quantities, and the dark gray line is China's percent market share over time. As you can see, China started out with a relatively low market share back in the early 90s, but by the mid 90s, that all changed. Unlike the US, China uses state-owned enterprises to produce their rare earths. So those companies are potentially influenced by larger CCP plans. What happened was that they consolidated their numerous operations, as John commented in the previous slide. But also, in addition to that, they have a somewhat of a competitive advantage in that they have a dirtier process that, but at the same time, produces cheaper materials. They also used a combination of export quotas, rebates, and tax relief to sell those same goods at cheaper prices to domestic customers, putting them at a competitive advantage downstream from the extraction sector. Along the way, they also grabbed a large portion of U.S. market share, and during that time also acquired a U.S. rare earth magnet producer, one that was making components for the JDAM bomb, as John alluded to earlier. And then that technical knowledge was used to build up additional magnet production capacity, and proceeded to, and that was leveraged to capture some more of that downstream market share. That eventually put the sole U.S. supplier of rare earths, Molycorp, at the time as it was known, out of business, and these Chinese state-owned enterprises basically became a cartel. It wasn't until the 2010 incident with Japan, where the state-owned enterprises threatened to cease exports to Japanese industry, that the rest of the world really took notice. Here, just to point out that the reaction to that incident, you can see that how prices rocketed and stayed elevated ever since 2010. And you can also see spikes within the more recently, after the previous administration started some rhetoric over trade war, and implemented some economic policies to emphasize that. And since then, state enterprises, those state enterprises have continued to consolidate. And it looks like the plan is basically to have one producer for heavies and another producer for lights. In the chart down here, you can see the extraction market share has decreased over time. But as we alluded to earlier, we look at the entire supply chain, not just one sector. And the processing of heavy rare earths and magnet production are both heavily concentrated in China still. So this makes rare earths an excellent case study, so that we could examine what happened in the past, what led us to that place, and what we could potentially to avoid this type of economic coercion that happened to Japan with respect to other critical minerals. So it'd be great if we had those measures in place to ensure that that if disruption does take place, whether intentional or not, that there's a sufficient response to fill in supply from there. Now I'll talk a little bit more about the battery side of stuff, with more emphasis on lithium. The demand for lithium is as expected to be dominated by electric vehicle adoption. But there are other uses for lithium as well in metallurgy and in medical and pharmaceuticals. The demand for batteries and for electric vehicles is tied to many policies and regulations from around the world that are legislating a switch to electric vehicles or otherwise banning the sale or registration of internal combustion engine vehicles. So even with these supply chains already constricted, there's additional demand that is expected to grow. And for example, if we look at the demand for lithium from the battery in EVs, comparing 2015 to 2021, there was lithium demand was about 31%. 31% of lithium demand came from batteries in EVs. In 2015 and 2021, that jumped up to 68%. That's largely due to an underdeveloped supply, and with prices reaching some of their highest that they've been in quite a while in response to that scarcity. And as a result, you're actually seeing an increase in battery cell prices after years and years of declining prices per kilowatt hour. Now, if we look out and look at what folks are projecting in the future as these policies for electric vehicles take shape past the 2030 2035 mark. If you look at the battery demand for 2030, it's expected that that the demand for lithium will be 92% just to serve batteries in electric vehicles. So it's and there are quite a few number of folks that we spoke to both during this project and subsequently that don't see supply matching that projected demand, and that supply demand gap is only going to grow as we move forward. So defense and aerospace also has their demands specifically for lithium and these battery materials as well. In terms of other uses for lithium, there are metallurgical uses. For example, aluminum lithium alloys. So metallurgical use cases to fill in demand from aerospace and defense. But as you can see from this chart, that comparing the 2015 to 2021 demand, the relative, even though the overall quantities may be demand quantities may be increasing relative to the growth in the electric vehicle and battery space, demand for within aerospace and defense is actually shrinking relative to that. So this puts the Department of Defense in a spot where they're going to be reacting to market trends over time, and they'll need to be able to navigate this future in ways to mitigate any risks to their suppliers. But DoD also has its own demand for batteries itself. For example, right now a lot of their tactical and non-tactical vehicles rely on what's called 6T lead acid batteries, and there is a large effort to replace these lead acid batteries with lithium-ion batteries. Approximately 95% of Army tactical vehicles rely on these, so a large percentage of that, approximately 225,000 vehicles in that fleet, require replacement. In the future, there's a growing demand for as well. Right now, I think according to 2021 report from DOE, there's currently about $200 million in annual procurements from the Defense Logistics Agency, DLA, and that's only expected to increase. But that $200 million figure doesn't include any acquisition of new systems, any batteries that may include as part of new system procurement. And then as the DoD looks to change the way their fleets and platforms that they're reliant upon, those new platforms may be more dependent upon distributed or austere energy, and those ConOps, those concepts of operation that require a longer logistics train to support, will also depend upon energy storage as well. And then finally, electric vehicles and hybrids may enter not just Army, but multiple services. Most recently, the DoD was directed to electrify non-tactical vehicles in the latest national defense strategy, although it was delayed quite a bit as the legislation evolved. But maybe tactical vehicles could be next. One example is the E-infantry squad vehicle prototype from GM, and that may be the first of other vehicles that may make the transition from hybrid or full battery electric vehicle. In this slide, we're looking a little bit more at the supply chain for lithium and a bit for the other materials as well. The market is evolving very quickly. This data was gathered back in 2021, and already it's out of date because that's how fast this market is evolving due to that demand from electric vehicle and electrification generally. But the general concept is the same, I think. A lot of lithium is coming from Australia and followed by Chile. But so the extraction part of the supply chain is more diversified than the rare earth situation when you compare it to China. China, has a lot of rare earth reserves that it can rely upon. When it comes to the battery supply chain, however, not as much. It didn't get as lucky in the geographic lottery that it did when in the rare earth situation. So there's a more diverse supply of extraction locales. But when you look at the processing and the component manufacturing for these lithium ion battery commodities and specialty chemicals, then you start to see the larger concentration of market share within China. And as you move up into the components, you can see a very high percentage of cathodes, anodes, and the cells that they go into. Much of that capacity is located within China, and they plan to only increase the number their capacity of gigafactories and these types of facilities as we move forward. And in comparison to that, the U.S. lithium supply chain, lithium-ion battery supply chain, has very little domestic capacity, but that's changing with most recent funding from DOE of I think it's about $2.3 billion of grants that went out to help establish that domestic supply chain to a variety of these materials. I will pass it back to John.
Thanks, Fabian. So recent domestic rare earth activities, if we just first look at the figure on the right, the main takeaway is that new stuff is happening, more production is happening. That is the formation of traditional rare earth mining activities. There's also non-traditional sources that are being procured, such as acid mine drainage, coal refuse, phosphate rock, and recycling activities of neodymium iron boron magnets. Additionally, processing and separation remains challenging and does remain a bottleneck for the US, but new efforts are being pursued. And the challenges that are faced by the mining, I would say mining industry in general, includes just lengthy times to become operational, on the order between like 10 to let's say 17 years. There's large capex, 500 million to $1 billion, and there's a declining skilled workforce. Next slide, please. And the future of rare earth oxide production outside of China shows one, a trend that is increasing, that there is a 100,000 metric ton increase between 2019 and 2025 for rare earth oxides. China in 2020 consumed just about half of that, and in 2025, 50,000 tons of rare earth oxide are projected to be online outside of China, which is only 15% of the projected demand. So this is still not enough to meet the demand outside of China. However, it does show that as far as processing goes, non-Chinese companies are starting to make up for that part of the market share. Next slide.
So here's some current activity, some recent activity in the lithium-ion battery supply chain. There's been a big change in the focus since 2017, when there was an executive order from the previous administration that really first published an initial listing of 25 materials that could qualify as critical and strategic, but also established their importance. In 2020, the next executive order declared a national emergency based off of material dependence on foreign adversaries, and directed agencies to investigate these dependencies and prioritize expanding domestic mineral production. And then the current administration largely followed in kind and continued to study the problem, commencing the 100-day critical mineral supply chain review, which is an excellent report. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It goes through into great depth in terms of both rare earths and lithium-ion batteries, but also other supply chains as well. And then in 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure bill allocated $7 billion of funding to build up that domestic battery supply chain, and as well as EV charging infrastructure. In 2022, a presidential determination for the Defense Production Act qualified lithium-ion batteries specifically for mining and processing to be applicable for those grants. And then in this previous year, the Inflation Reduction Act, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's mandates as part of the mandates as part of the requirements for acquiring a rebate, it mandated that there's domestic sourcing of these raw materials and production of these cells for electric vehicle rebates. And there's language that effectively bans raw materials from China or Russia within a upcoming time frame. And then, as I mentioned earlier, most recently there was about $2.3 billion in grants that was used to help establish that domestic capacity for not just extraction, but also some recycling capacity and a little bit of processing capacity. And there should be more of those to come. So we'll start to transition over to our work and what we hope to add to the conversation. The RAND team here conducted an internal day after workshop using RAND SMEs to help frame the problem. And the problem that they looked at was a disruption scenario coming out of China focused on rare earths. This looked at a 2023 timeframe, so this year we'll see what happens. These RAND SMEs were asked to discuss policy options from the perspective of the DoD as well, to aid defense and aerospace suppliers and to take their perspective into account as well. So some basic assumptions based off of that gap that John was speaking to earlier. Effectively, 40 to 50% of the product had been cut off during this disruption. The disruption is done without export controls or via regulatory mechanisms, which therefore makes it exempt from WTO involvement. And then China has, the last assumption is that China has long-term contracts with domestic firms that cannot be broken, and therefore they are prioritized in terms of supply. And then when we asked our participants to take the perspective of industry, we asked them to focus on a couple of different time frames. One of which is the time to survive, or basically how long a company can last until it is unable to continue operations, until it goes into the financial trouble and might be going into bankruptcy, or might be looking at other ventures looking to acquire them, that sort of time frame. The other time frame that we asked them to consider is the time to recover, which is basically how long it takes to find an alternative source and continue those operations. Now, ideally, you want that time to recover to be less than that time to survive, because you don't want your business to to basically exit the market before you even get a chance to start up production again. So whatever that time frame may be for that particular production process for that mineral, that should be taken into account in terms of how long a business can last. And with respect to the time and a policy lever that may be pulled, whether it be Defense Production Act, whether it be a CFIUS evaluation of an acquisition or something, whatever that policy is, that policy should react in a time frame that is able to accompany or help out before that time to survive runs out. And of course, there's some limitations to our approach. Timelines and relationships between customers and suppliers, and the magnitude of the impact of these components onto DoD platforms are not are things that we could get better feedback from using a different approach or an expanded approach. So as part of the feedback from our day after workshop, basically we came up with some hazards from the disruption, and we came up with this notional risk register, quote unquote. Excuse me. Now, a traditional risk register will have the list of risks but also will have an indication of degree of impact or the cost associated with that risk, and then a measure of likelihood associated with that, with usually a statistical probability of that risk happening, taking place, and that's usually your calculation. But so we call this more of a hazard register, a register of hazards than a true risk register. So bear with us on the terminology. But some of that feedback of the day after workshop was that the likelihood of a deliberate scenario was low, but the impact would still be significant. And our participants noticed that there was probably alternative scenarios that would generate the same kind of effect and be more likely. Some of those alternative scenarios could be that China takes environmental damage and sustainability more seriously and starts enforcing these new regulations that have an impact on supply. Another plausible scenario might be that an industrial accident disables one of these major state-owned enterprises or another supplier from a different supply chain. And then in response to that, Chinese government officials crack down, and that results in decreases in supply. And then there could also be a method that China, an alternative method for China to limit the effects of this disruption to the U.S. and or other countries such as the Quad group. Now, one of the main reasons that the participants thought that the scenario, deliberate scenario, was low was because there was an almost complete assumption that any disruption outside would not be limited to a single targeted country. It would affect the entire market and affect countries other than the intentional target. So that would actually hurt some of these some of the specificity that of that particular geopolitical lever that could be pulled. But on the other hand, as our participants noted, was that China does have a history of economic coercion. This is usually done by restricting access to domestic markets. For example, when they banned beef imports from Australia, or sometimes it's by other means, like when they banned their citizens from visiting South Korea on travel for holiday. But there is one exception to that, to those usual types of coercion, and that is, of course, the restriction of rare earths to Japan in that 2010 dispute over those islands. So it remains a possibility moving forward. Now, in terms of the hazards that we identified, we categorized them into 3 buckets. One is the competition phase, the industrial readiness, and the operational. The competition we defined as economic competition, the ability for the broader U.S. economy to access these materials. In terms of for industrial readiness, we defined that as the ability for the defense industrial base to access these material inputs for production of platforms for the military or other services within them, and then the operational hazards in which there's a disruption to an actual conflict or ongoing near conflict operation going on. And so what we found is that most of these hazards, and this is not a complete list, do have some effect on the industrial readiness, and it's really only the extreme cases when these hazards compound, that you have operational risk. And then we also found that companies with poor financial standing are likely to be the most vulnerable to bankruptcy or acquisition during a disruption scenario. I'll hand it back over to John.
Thanks, Fabian. So after the day after exercise, we were able to, from the RAND SMEs, develop a list of policy options that are going to be available to the Department of Defense. Now, all the policy options listed here are not necessarily available to the DoD, and the list is not meant to be exhaustive. The ones available to the DoD are in orange. So the day after exercise provided policy options for a reactive posture, and the day before for a proactive posture. Some of the ones that are proactive would be considered stockpiling, RDT&E, such as looking for alternative sources, secondary production, using SBIRS funding. Things that fall into either bucket include the Defense Production Act Title III, which funds companies to supply essential domestic resources, or Defense Production Act Title VII, which has several provisions, but two of them that are important would be convening, the president convening experts on a topic area and conducting industrial base assessments. Another thing that could be either would be a direct investment into a company. Reactive policy options could be, instead of stockpiling, would be releasing stockpiles. Defense Production Act Title I, which it allocates resources to promote national defense. So you can, an example of that was during the COVID-19 pandemic, when former President Trump allocated masks. And I think that's all I wanted to say about our policy options, Fabian, unless you want to add something.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when it comes to, which I alluded to earlier, is that when it comes to the reactive policies, the time that it takes for these policies to be felt, to have real world effects felt in industry, it really determines the utility, the usefulness of that policy. If it, for example, it takes if we're releasing stockpiles, if it takes more than, let's say, 2 weeks, if a lithium supply, a lithium processor takes 2 weeks to change its raw material into a lithium carbonate equivalent, then releasing stockpiles needs to happen within that time frame. If you're reallocating resources from DPA Title I, it needs to happen in a pretty quick manner, so that you do get those alternative suppliers, and you meet that business's time to recover. And then the only other thing that I would add is that in terms of reactive policies, some of these are a little bit more aggressive, right? Economic retaliation in terms of sanctions, those sort of things. Depending on the root cause of the scenario, if it was a natural, if it was due to natural causes, if there was some incident or that shut down production, an earthquake or something else, then of course that eliminates some of these options as well. Okay, I will continue and with what we learned that can be applied to a lithium scenario. So the rare earth was our main case study and we wish to use that as the framework to try and extract what could be used for other critical material supply chains. And we took a slightly closer look at lithium and asked our workshop participants to see what they could learn from the experience from the rare earth exercise, and what they recommend in terms of lithium. I won't go through all of these, but I'll sample a couple. First of all, not every critical mineral supply chain is going to be the same as the rare earth situation. As I was talking about earlier, the lithium itself is pretty diverse in terms of its geographic location of reserves and resources. A lot of it is coming from Australia and Chile, as well as elsewhere. So the landscape of the extraction, processing, and component manufacturing, that landscape changes with each mineral supply chain, and you're going to have to identify which vulnerabilities, you're going to have to look at how the vulnerabilities change with respect to each of them, and that should be reflected in terms of how the DLA may be stockpiling some of these materials as well. And they're going to have each one of these minerals has different chemistries, which means that the ability to substitute them during a supply disruption is also going to change as well. But overall, what are the policy goals for these other supply chains? Really, it's to prevent another rare earth situation, and in order to do that, you want to support the diversification of the mid and downstream supply chains when we're talking about lithium, because that's where the processing and the component manufacturing lies, and as well as so we're talking about anodes, cathodes, and cells. And then you want to monitor these things over time, and look for any price spikes or areas where there may be activity in terms of shortening supply. And looking at what the lithium vulnerabilities may be, the mid to downstream activities like the cell and processing sectors are most vulnerable because, as we talked about earlier, that's where there's a highly concentrated capacity right now within China. And China has already demonstrated investment activity within the South American lithium producers, as well as within Africa in the DRC for cobalt suppliers, and now looking to invest heavily in Indonesia for nickel. So keeping an eye on the amount of Chinese investment activity in these other suppliers is paramount to keeping an eye on those vulnerabilities. And then finally, a couple of policy options that make sense. Because of the geography of these minerals, we're going to have to rely on partners and allies. There's no way around it. A lot of what we're getting already comes from some of these partners and allies, and using some methods of preferred sourcing from them, from Japan, South Korea, Australia. These folks make sense in our mind. But also paying attention to some of those non-traditional countries and encouraging extraction, processing, or even cell production, increasing that capacity within those countries makes sense to us as well. So we'll leave you here with a couple of our conclusions and takeaways. We're already at the 53-minute mark, so we went over quite a bit. But I'll end it here, unless John, you want to add something. But otherwise, I think we can switch over to discussion and Q&A.
Let's do it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to Fabian and John. Very informative presentation.